Hi there, and welcome to Warhammer 6th Edition review. My name's Nick. I'll be reviewing Warhammer 6th Edition from the start of its inception and the creation of the rulebook in 2000 up until it came to an end 6 years later. What I'm going to do for this first review here, this is my first attempt at doing this, so bear with me, guys. If I'm maybe missing a few things out, feel free to tell me in the comments at all. What I'll be doing in this first episode is I will be reviewing the background as to how 6th edition Warhammer came about, a bit of information on Warhammer 5th edition. I'll talk about the 6th edition rulebook, and this episode is going to be a little longer than what I usually intend on doing because I'll be reviewing the first release, which was the Empire Army book, and also I'll be flicking through the White Dwarf that we got as well, which accompanied the release of the 6th edition rulebook. So I'm going to call this episode A New Old World, and we're going to give some background context. So by the end of 5th edition, let's just see what had 5th edition become by the end of it. So there have been little changes really to the core army book within 8 years, to be honest. The core book hadn't really changed much from 4th edition through to 5th edition. A lot of the army books that were being used in 5th edition had been released in the early 90s or mid-90s along with 4th edition, so there were very, very few army books actually released during 5th edition. There was Vampire Counts, Chaos, High Elves, Dogs of War, and I think that was pretty much it. I think White Dwarf released a Tomb Kings of Khemri list, which was quite basic. It really was the bare bones, pardon the expression, to what would become the Tomb Kings. So what had really happened in Warhammer 5th edition by the end? You had several campaign packs such as Tears of Isha, and you had ones. There's the Bretonnian and Undead one. Forgive me if I can't remember the name of it. And there's various campaign packs, and they had some nice card buildings, and they had rules for some new characters. The Bretonnian and Undead campaign had the Red Duke and the Banshee, etc., and things like that, which eventually would go into the 5th edition Vampire Counts book, which replaced the old 4th edition Undead book. By the end of 5th edition, there's a lot of... Because the expansion pack, the Warhammer Magic expansion pack, there's a feeling that there was too many expansions required. You had an expansion pack for Siege, you had the campaign books, you had a lot of expansion packs to keep the game fresh, because after 8 years you need a bit of renewal. Okay? You saw that a lot of the older army books just weren't as competitive anymore. I think one of the last battle reports that they released in Warhammer 5th edition was actually at the release of the Vampire Counts book. I think it was Vampire Counts against Empire when they were released, and the Empire book at that point was about 6 or 7 years old or something along those lines, and they were just wiped out. I know it's a White Dwarf battle report. White Dwarf battle reports were always kind of designed to kind of favour the new releases, so there's a degree of bias in that sense. And they weren't really very competitive either. So by the end of it, change was needed. The older books needed to be updated. Some of them were horrifically old and just weren't competitive at all. The models, they hadn't been changed in a long time either. They were starting to move away from the old monopose led Marauder miniatures, and they were looking towards sort of multi-part plastic kits. And towards the end of 5th edition, they'd released, I believe they'd released the sort of zombies, Skaven clan rats. They'd released an Empire Regiment, Chaos Knights, Warriors of Chaos, things like that. A Goblin box set, an Orc box set as well, which would have replaced the old monopose plastic ones. So at that point, they decided to freshen it up. So that when they released Warhammer 6th, the new starter box contained new armies. It contained Empire and an Orc army. The Orc army contained a chariot, a unit of Orc boys, some archers, and a warlord on a warboar, or you could put them on foot if you want. You had that option. The Empire army contained spearmen, handgunners, a cannon, and a general on a horse. The main differences between 5th and 6th edition was that the rules have been slimmed down an awful lot. There's no need for a magic expansion pack anymore, which some people may have been cheering to the rafters, because a lot of the magic items that you could include really could sort of impact the game in a quite sort of heavy way. You really had to kind of have a gentleman's agreement or house rules as to not to use various magic items. There were magic items which meant you could um, cast spells for free each turn, etc., and things like that. It really really gave someone an unfair advantage. So they slimmed it down. They changed the magic. Um, a lot of magic items were kind of auto-include in 5th edition, so you had things like Crown of Command, the Black Amulet, the Heart of Woe. You'd see them in almost every single list. The Crown of Command gave you unmodified leadership 10. You could give that to your Skaven Warlord and they wouldn't break. You give it to a Goblin Warlord and the unit wouldn't break. It kind of defeats the purpose of the Cowardly Goblins and the idea that Skaven are only competitive in large numbers. It kind of took away the character of the army, because any kind of faults that you had with the army, any kind of weaknesses could just be taken out with a magic item. So if you had low leadership, Crown of Command. If you had low strength, Giant Blade. If you had a really, really powerful character in one army, you could use the Black Gem of Nar, and that would just essentially take that opponent, this powerful character, out the game altogether. So that was kind of changed as well. Spellcasting wasn't balanced. The Winds of Magic deck was too random. Spell decks were also often not balanced. You had some really powerful decks such as Necromantic Magic and High Magic. They were very good, whereas the less good ones were Battle Magic, for example. You had 2 or 3 good spells out of a 20-strong deck. The College Magic, which was used in 4th edition, was really overpowered in a lot of people's opinions, and therefore, although you could technically use it, and a lot of people didn't mind doing that. I mean, I'm happy if someone wanted to use College Magic against me, it wouldn't bother me. But in other cases, I think some people would just think that's a bit too much. So changes in the new rulebook. In 5th edition, you had your rulebook and you had your battle book. The battle book contained how not the rules of the game, but how to organize about what scenario to play. It had a breakdown of the different races and the different armies you could use, and it had a bestiary section at the end, etc., and how to play campaigns. All that was incorporated into the new rulebook for 6th edition, so it was a 288-page book, largely black and white, a couple of colour photos in the middle to represent some of the miniatures and some of the heavy metal team's paint jobs and whatnot, but it's essentially all black and white. The rulebook was written by Rick Priestley and Thomas Brinneran. It's largely regarded as being, people looking back now, they see it as the most balanced edition. It's certainly the version that I played the most games of, probably because I started playing Warhammer towards the end of 5th edition. I started playing Warhammer in the end of 1997. I got my 5th edition starter box Christmas 97. That's when I started playing. So by within 3 years, 6th edition had come out, and I was just playing that constantly instead. So it's the edition that I've played the most games on. I was fortunate enough to have a lot of brothers who also played Warhammer as well. We had a little gaming table set up as well, so we were quite lucky in that respect that we could play games pretty much whenever we wanted without, taking over the living room or anything like that. The main difference between 6th and 5th edition, first of all, magic. No more magic cards, no more Winds of Magic decks. The magic items went down from the hundreds to a couple of common ones, and you get race-specific ones written into the army books. Turn sequence had changed. You'd start casting spells in the second phase of the game rather than the last. That was always probably the biggest change. Rules to flying changed, and you had things like unit strength, parry, all those things were added in. Also, the cost of the units and the troops had also dropped dramatically, enabling you to field more models on the tabletop. I think at one point, you had a point where, I think a wood elf war dancer was about 35 points or something insane like that. Although it was quite effective in the game, it's toughness 3 with a save of 5. Or even a save of 6, I think, or something along those lines. Toughness 3, save of 6, 35 points. If it gets into combat, it's absolutely great. But if you're against anything with missile troops at all, those are the first things gone, because you do not want a unit of war dancers tying up your Cold War Knights, or your Dragon Princes, or your Bretonian Knights, or anything like that. So the first thing you do is just shoot them off the board if you can, provided they're not being hidden behind trees and walls, etc. So with the release of 6th edition, all the old army books from 5th were completely obsolete. And in order to kind of compensate for this, Games Workshop released the Ravening Horde supplement in an episode of White Dwarf, which corresponded with the release of 6th edition. It was a set of get you by lists for all armies except, I believe, Dogs of War, which was later released in a White Dwarf issue and actually appears in the 2002 Warhammer Annual as well. So if you can't get hold of the White Dwarf 2002 Annual, it's got rules for different scenarios and whatnot, and it's also got a Dogs of War list for you as well. I remember my brother at the time wasn't massively pleased. He'd just spent a lot of money on a Dogs of War army, and within a year and a half to 2 years, he felt that he couldn't use it anymore. You could use Regiments of Renown in the army books, but we'll go through those when we go through the sort of book-by-book analysis. Let's see, so like I said, the starter box contained Empire and Orcs and card scenery as well, 1 card building, similar to the Mordheim scenery that you got in the Mordheim box set, a bit of card, plastic kind of corners which you just slot the card in, make up a little kind of semi-ruined house. And this box retailed at £50, so it was a pretty good bargain back in the day. I didn't get that box myself. I didn't collect either Empire or Orcs. I collected at the time Warriors of Chaos, so I just got the rulebook for Christmas in 2000. First books that they released were Empire, and within a month later Orcs and Goblins. That's kind of the usual thing for Warhammer Fantasy. Usually the first books released were always Empire and Orcs and Goblins. I think it was the same in 4th. I think Empire and Orcs were the first released, along with maybe Dwarfs as well, actually, for that matter. But yeah, always some of the first books releases always Empire and Orcs. Empire received the new regiment boxes, so you got a set of new knights, etc., and things like that. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to move on and just have a look at the Empire book itself. So the Empire book, it really changed an awful lot since 5th edition. So gone were your halflings, your imperial dwarfs, steam tank had disappeared, Reichsguard foot troops had disappeared. Was there anything else that disappeared? Oh yeah, about 90% of the special characters. In fact, actually, all of the special characters disappeared from the 4th edition book when it transitioned to 6th. So Karl Franz, Boris Todbringer, the Ice Queen, all the Elector Counts. Supreme Patriarch had been replaced with another model. He'd gone as well. Everything had just been completely overhauled. So what you got with the Empire book is you got some nice new multi-part infantry. So you could build either spearmen or... Oh no, actually you couldn't build spearmen. No, you couldn't. Ignore me, I'm talking rubbish. You couldn't build spearmen. Spearmen came as part of the starter box, and I believe that they were unique. I do not believe that you could actually collect spearmen. So may correct me on that. It may have been a separate box in that case, perhaps a detachment box, but I certainly recall that you could get halberdiers and swordsmen in one of the regiment boxes. And I think, yeah, it may be spearmen in a detachment box you could get, so maybe that's something separate. And you also got your multi-part Knights of the Empire kits, so gone with the old Metal Reichsguard, Knights Panther, Blazing Sun, and White Wolf individual models that you'd be able to get in the blister pack, or the 3 for however many pounds it was, a £10 or 15 quid or whatever you can get, or back in 4th edition. That was replaced with a £12 box of 8 knights, and you could assemble them into either Reichsguard, Knights Panther, or White Wolf. And I believe for the Blazing Sun, you actually had to buy a separate sprue for those specific parts. Good luck finding that on eBay for a reasonable price. It costs an arm and a leg, so to try and find that is quite an achievement. In fact, actually to find the Knight box at a reasonable price these days is quite an achievement, because those things go for megabucks now, since Games Workshop pretty much got rid of the whole lot of them. So again, War Altar was gone, the War Wagon was gone, Karl Franz on Deathclaw has gone, and that was replaced with Warrior Priests, a new Hellblaster volley gun model, a new plastic cannon model, and you had the Militia, which was released in the Mordheim box. I believe Mordheim was a Millennium project that they released. It was a bit like Gorka Morka, but in Warhammer Fantasy, and still got a big. In fact, it's actually probably more popular now than it was when it was first released. But the kind of human Empire warband from that box set was used then as the militia models. You got like the human warband, you got a Skaven warband in it. Skaven became the Night Runner box set in the Skaven book for 6th edition, which we'll cover at that time, and the humans became the Empire militia. And you can pose them in different armaments. You can give them, double-handed weapons, pitchforks, swords, brace of pistols. You can give them bows, etc., and things like that. And you can make them into huntsmen and stuff. So, there's very few kits out, but you could do an awful lot with them. And I think that was the main aim with 6th edition, is that you could actually do an awful lot with these kits. And you could even combine them as well, And you could combine the standard bearer's arms and banner from the Empire infantry box, stick it on a knight, and you've got yourself a pretty nifty battle standard bearer. Quite simple conversions. Everything kind of fit together. You could convert anything you want. We had 2 new characters. We had Luther Huss and Balthazar Gelt. Both fantastic miniatures. I don't have Balthazar Gelt. I have Luther Huss. Luther Huss was a warrior priest on a horse, and Balthazar Gelt was a metal wizard on a Pegasus who'd replaced the old Supreme Patriarch model. Both great characters. It's regrettable not to see Karl Franz and others there, and some of the Elector Counts. You could still buy some of the Elector Count models, but Karl Franz, no. The model for Karl Franz had gone, but you could still buy a nice Empire Captain. I think it was an Elector Count on Griffin you could buy. Fantastic looking model, not really great in gaming terms, just too easy to kill, but a cracking looking model nonetheless. So, what else we've got to say about the Empire book? So they also included as well the new character of the engineer, and that could sit alongside your artillery and could help make your cannons more reliable and your Hellblaster volley gun more reliable. And at the point, I think from 6th edition onwards to 8, in any Empire army with artillery, which, why would you have an Empire army without artillery? Engineers were just an auto-include. I mean, you would not set up an Empire army without that. You'd always take an engineer just to make your war machines that more accurate. With the Reichsguard foot troops gone as the kind of elite infantry from 4th and 5th edition, up stepped the Great Swords. The Great Swords were in the 4th and 5th edition book, but they were pretty terrible, to be honest. I mean, I'd say they were arguably the worst infantry in the Empire army in 4th and 5th edition. They were terrible. Save a 6, toughness 3, always strikes last. I mean, who on earth would take those in an army? If they weren't they had so many better options. Reichsguard foot troops, at least they had, an improved strength or I think it was either an improved strength or toughness, a better armor save, and whatnot, and they were just all round more reliable. You could get your general in there, big unit of 15, 16 Reichsguard foot troops, give them a magic banner, and they just weren't going anywhere. They were really, really, really good, but they dropped them and replaced them with great swords. But they improved the rules for great swords. They gave them a better armor save with full plate armor. They made them stubborn so they wouldn't run away. Much, much, much improved. And although they still struck last with their great swords, you could at least try and stick a character in there who could maybe dish out a bit of damage first before the rest of his men were slaughtered unceremoniously. So, but definitely an improvement. Definitely improvement. So, and they were given nice new models as well, which look quite sweet. They were less kind of clunky than the old ones, although the old ones had their charm. So the character of the Empire army was maintained in 6th edition, which is always good to see. So I always thought the character of the Empire army is average troops, but when used as a coherent force, it's greater than some of its parts. So you can have the detachment rule, which is fantastic. If you can have a small unit of men, half the number or less than the parent unit, which could make charge reactions if the parent unit was charged. So if someone comes into your big unit, a swordsman, your handgunners could stand and shoot, or your halberdier detachment could flank them. Made them really, really, really deadly to play against, because if you ran in there with a average to even decent unit of infantry, unless they were exceptional, if you ran in there, it was tough to break them. A unit of swordsmen for the Empire with 2 detachments or even just 1 detachment, pardon me, was incredibly hard to break down. Just relying on them, maybe, the leadership still wasn't great, but things like that, little special rules like that really kind of enhanced the character of the Empire and made them quite a tough thing to go up against. So, what else can we say about the Empire? So yeah, the 2 main lord choices for the Empire, we've got your Elector Count and the Grand Master, and your heroes are your captains and warrior priests. You got a Wizard Lord as your Lord level wizard, not surprisingly, and a Wizard Hero. They could use any law of magic which was contained in the Warhammer rulebook, which meant they were instantly better than what they were in 5th edition compared to just using battle magic. So, Empire Wizards went from probably one of the worst in the game, if you weren't using college magic, of course, to probably one of the most kind of diverse multi-purpose wizards in the game. Elector Count is a cheap general. If you want to have a cheap general, pick yourself an Elector Count. If you want a more effective one, Grandmaster all the way. Grandmaster, stick him a year to Knights. He's quite a bit more expensive, but he's, massively more effective. Sticking a Warrior Priest inside the unit with their blessings, etc., meant they could really enhance the effectiveness of your troops and make them far more resilient. So it was all kind of like synergy and buffing kind of made the Empire from average to poor to really quite decent if you organise them effectively. Your core choices are your knights, your infantry, and your militia. And your special choices are cannons and pistoliers. Your rare choices are great swords, volley gun, dogs of war, and flagellants. I mean, really, you kind of spoiled for choice here, to be honest. I don't think you really need great swords or flagellants for that matter, or even dogs of war. Volley gun's probably the only rare unit you need. Take 2 of them, perhaps. Core choices, great. Infantry, knights, militia. For your special choices, cannons, pistols would be good as a little distraction unit, but you could equally use huntsmen as a, you could, redirect some of your opponent's charges. You could block some units. You could lure out fanatics and stuff like that. You could block line of sight, that kind of thing. So they were cheap, they were handy, they were really effective, just protecting those kind of more expensive units, like your knights, like your big unit of 30 halberdiers or 20 swordsmen or whatnot. And the swordsmen were really kind of the core infantry unit to use in 6th edition Empire. They're much better than the spearmen because their armour was better and the weapon skill was better. And they were better than halberdiers because, once again, they had the parry save. The parry save made them an armour save of 4, weapon skill 4. So even against average troops, like, you go Saurus warriors, they were weapon skill 3. Clan rats, goblins, orcs, they were fantastically effective against other core troops, and they were an awful lot cheaper. So I sound like I'm singing the praises of the Empire here, but it's it was a cracking list back at the start of 6th. It was very, very effective. So, what kind of things make a good Empire army in 6th edition, and what kind of strategies were good in the games? So, like I said before, Grandmaster, no-brainer. Better stats, including leadership. Additionally, Warrior Priests were great. Stick a Warrior Priest in the unit as well, makes them more effective in combat, makes them likely to stick around longer. It also gives you more protection in the magic phase, and it means that you could try and cast some of your blessings and maybe try and use up some of your opponent's dispel dice. Infantry, like I said, swordsman, auto-include, 4+ parry save. Stick in the militia as a detachment, and a warrior priest in the unit, and you've got a solid unit, tough to break. Right. Cannons, obviously 2 cannons, always take 2 cannons. And you could get some knights to hide a wizard in, hide your general in, and go off and start hunting some of your opponent's tougher units. Gives you a bit of mobility and gives your opponents something else to think about. I always thought that an Empire army is sitting by itself, forming a gun line. It's not the most effective way to play Empire. The whole point of Empire is a kind of toolkit army. You can use it in a variety of ways, but it's best to take something with a bit of everything so you can react to different things. So it's very good in that respect. So, moving on. So, flagellants. I never used flagellants in 6th edition, so I wouldn't know what they were like. If anyone used 6th edition Empire and used flagellants, please by all means let me know what they were like. If they're any good, if they're worth taking or not. Were they effective against units with sort of massed archers and whatnot? I know they were stubborn or something along those lines, but they're tough to break, but still. What were they like? The Elector Count and the Griffin. Would you take the Elector Count and the Griffin? I wouldn't take the Elector Count and the Griffin. Just cannon fodder. Just shoot them down. Just a giant target. You much better just taking someone else and hiding them in a unit that way. So overall, what do I think about the Empire book? Well, the Empire book I thought was actually excellent toolkit army. Not the best, but certainly not the worst. And if anyone's going around playing 6th edition Warhammer still, definitely worth having a go with the Empire. You know, the army's not going to be absolutely huge, it's not like a horde army like Skaven or Goblins, but it's also not a small elite army like High Elves or Chaos Warriors. It's just kind of somewhere, it's somewhere in the middle. It's quite balanced. You can get a lot of fun out of it. They're fun to paint because you've got a variety of different kind of troop choices. You can use. You're not exactly painting the same thing over and over and over again. It's not like a Warhammer 40,000 Imperial Guard army where you're just painting, or a Space Marine army where you're just painting the same colour scheme on absolutely everything. You do actually get a bit of variety. You can paint your militia a different colour and your knights a different colour, and you've got the odd character painting them a different colour and whatnot. And you don't even have to paint all your units from the same province. You can have like a combined province army, which is fantastic. What's the downside though? The models, because they're all kind of multi-kit from the same box, they kind of looked a bit samey. A lot of the core units lacked variety, although you could paint them in different colours and whatnot. They all kind of looked the same. That's not surprising. It's an Empire army. They're supposed to kind of look uniform, I suppose, but they did start to look quite samey after a while. So you had the options to kind of add a bit of variety to your Empire army, but the variety that you'd include weren't the best choices. So as long as you're not too fussed about that, yeah, go for it. But I think it's a fantastic army. It's certainly worth collecting. So it kind of lacked a bit of the kind of pomp and splendour of the old 4th edition army, where you had these big massive plumes on their helmets and whatnot, and every unit was an individual model in itself. You didn't have like handgunners, crossbowmen, spearmen, halberdiers, swordsmen. They all pretty much came from the same stock regiment box set. All these in 4th edition were individual ones. It wasn't really until you got to like 8th edition where you could properly customise the regiments to the extent that they actually could look very distinct from one another. So that's my look at the Empire book. Oh, actually, before we finish with the Empire book, there's also some armies at the back. You could also have some armies which you were urged to use with your opponent's consent only. And you had things such as the Artillery Army of Nuln, where your sort of special, rare, and core choices would change depending on what sort of army you had. So if you had an Artillery Army of Nuln, it would change volley guns to special choices or cannons to core choices, but you couldn't have more artillery than you could have regiments, but you could certainly include more artillery than you could do in a standard army. You also had the Emperor's Bodyguard, etc., Karl Franz's Bodyguard, but I'm not quite sure if they made a mistake or not when they're writing the book, because when you see the Emperor's Bodyguard army list, it says you can only have this if you include Karl Franz as your general. Problem being, there were no rules for Karl Franz in the book, so I don't know if that was written maybe before they decided to have someone like Karl Franz in the book or not. I know that they included the rules for Karl Franz in I believe Storm of Chaos. I think they had the rules for Karl Franz. It was either Storm of Chaos or it was an issue of White Dwarf, but they did include the rules for Karl Franz. And in fact, the Steam Tank at a later date, they were included later on down the line. So maybe at that point you could include Karl Franz, but certainly when the book was initially released, there were no rules for Karl Franz. So I don't know how you could possibly include that. Maybe there's a slight oversight. But a lot of the books actually in 6th edition had these kind of variant lists at the end of them. I know that we'll be talking more about that in the Orc and Goblin book that I'll be doing at a later date. I'm trying to kind of get the White Dwarfs that correspond with the release date of the books, but some of them are quite tough to find, so I've got a couple of them at the moment, and I missed out on getting the Orc one. I tried to get the Orc one on eBay for, obviously you can get them, but I want to get them at a reasonable price. I'm not paying like £5 or £6 for a White Dwarf magazine from 20 years ago. I go about as high as 3, and that's about it. And I unfortunately missed out on a couple of them the other week, but I'm trying to kind of get the ones on board which correspond to the release date of the books, and I'm trying to obviously review these books in the chronological order in which they were released. to the best of my knowledge anyway. If I've made a mistake in any of that, please by all means correct me. If anyone's got a list of the release dates, who's got a bit of knowledge about this, by all means correct me. It's my first attempt at doing this, so I'm flying on the seat of my pants here, to be honest, but we'll see how it all goes. Anyway, a special bonus for you. We have a look at the White Dwarf from the release of the Empire book and the release of Warhammer 6th edition. So it was released in October 2000, and the first half of the book, I mean, it also corresponds with the 250th edition of White Dwarf, so a lot of it's kind of aimed at people who are possibly looking to get into the hobby rather than established gamers. That obviously released the Ravening Horde's Army List book as well, which is fantastic. I don't have a copy of that book, unfortunately, and they're a bit pricey on eBay for what they are anyway, and I wouldn't really use it in a game, to be honest. But yeah, the first half of that White Dwarf is actually explained what all the Warhammer races are. It then has a review of the Empire book and a little bit of talk about Empire strategy. And then it goes into a battle report against Orcs and Goblins using the rules from the Orcs and Goblin book a month before it was actually released. It's a 2,000 points each side. It's a pitched battle. It pits, like I say, Empire against Orcs and Goblins, and it is a resounding victory for the Empire. But with that in mind, the next issue of White Dwarf would have a return match, Orcs versus Empire, following the release of the Orcs and Goblin book, and it was 3,000 points aside. I have no idea how that goes or ends, because like I say, I couldn't get hold of that White Dwarf, but hopefully by the time I do another one of these episodes, I may well have it. I hope I have it. But if anyone's even got a PDF copy of it and they want to send it to me, that'll be appreciated too. Anyway, so with that in mind, that's the end of my review for the start of Warhammer 6th edition, A New Old World. Tell me what you think. Is there any improvements I need to make? Any facts that I've not maybe got quite right? Anything along the lines of things that you'd like to see included? Maybe more photographs. I don't really have much in the way of editing software at all, so I'm just doing this on my iPad. I'm just basically going through my photo slides and recording my screen as I talk. So at the end of this, you'll see me kind of slide down the stop record button at the end like a total amateur, but this is it just now. Like I say, I've not got the software to make this any more sophisticated, but I thought I'll just try and rely on content alone and get me by anything other than anything more flashy. I've actually got quite a bit of Warhammer stuff model wise. Not that I'm boasting at all, it's just that I've been collecting it for that long. If you want to see pictures of some of the units that I have, that'd be great. I don't mind photographing some things. As with most Warhammer collectors, not everything's painted. Apparently I heard that if you paint your last model, you die. So, I'd like to live. So not everything that I have is painted. But my Empire army is probably, along with my Warriors of Chaos army, the most painted army that I have. Just because I've felt like I don't really want to do all the same colours. So each unit's from a different province. That kind of keeps things fresh for me. And it's spanning 4 editions worth of Warhammer, so I've got stuff from 4th edition, 5th edition, 6th, 7th, 8th. So it's great and varied, and I can really field an Empire army for any edition right now, which I can't say the same for some of the other armies I have. My Dark Elves, for example, I can field in 4th, 5th, and 6th, maybe 7th, but certainly I couldn't field one in 8th. I just don't have the model count or some of the models that I'd need to form a decent 8th edition army. But we're not talking about 8th edition, we're talking about 6th edition. The next video I release will be hopefully next week. It will be on Orcs and Goblins. We'll have a good chat about them, see the differences between the old book and the new one, and what kind of good lists there are. If anyone's got any advice for me at all as to what kind of Orc and Goblin lists were really effective, I didn't play Orcs and Goblins in 6th either. My brother played them in 5th, and he was pretty good with them, to be honest. He was pretty deadly with Orcs in 5th edition. In 5th edition, Orcs were a very, very good list. Unpredictable, funny, a lot of fun, but when things went right, they'd just take you off the board in a couple of turns. They were that good. So I don't really know what they were like in 6th. I've only got a rough idea just looking through the book as to what kind of armies you could create. But if anyone's got any kind of big combinations for either Empire or Orcs that you'd like me to go through and talk about, leave them in the comments below. I don't know how many people are going to watch this. Hopefully more than 2. That'll be alright. I'm going to post this on my YouTube site. It'll be my first ever video released on YouTube. And I'll put this on some Warhammer community pages on Facebook and direct people towards it. Let me know what you think. Until next week, have a good week. Happy wargaming. Take care. This is Nick signing off. Goodbye.